Hi, second grade. What we are going to look at in this video are quarters on a clock. I know we've talked about quarters when we talk about counting money, but quarters on a clock are a little bit different as far as the amount goes. And we'll talk in a moment about why that is. So we're actually going to build another clock, but we have a different purpose for building our clock today. So if you have a paper plate, you can grab one. If not, you can just draw a circle on a piece of paper. Either way will be completely fine for this little clock that we're going to make today. So we're going to start by putting the main numbers on the clock that will help us figure out quarter hours. So let's start again by putting a dot as close to the center of your plate as you can get. So I'm going to move mine down just a little bit. Make it so we can tell that it's there. So at the top of our clock, we are going to put the hour of 12. Right down from that 12 on the opposite side of the clock, we are going to put a 6. Go off to the side, put the number 3, go across to the other side, and put the number 9. Before we fill in the rest of the numbers, boys and girls, we are going to actually draw some lines on the clock to show what quarters on a clock look like. So first, what I'd like you to do is to go ahead and circle each number that we've made on the clock. That'll just help us to know that when we have our minute hand pointed to one of those numbers, 12, 3, 6, or 9, that time could be considered a quarter hour time, or we could count different quarters depending on where that minute hand would happen to be. So circle those numbers. And then what we want to do is we want to simply draw lines from the center dot up to the number. So we're going to go from here to here, down to the 6, that line connects with the line above, and then 1 over to the 3, and 1 from the 9 to the circle. Whoops, I made that one a little bit off there since I was looking a different way, but that'll work. So when you look at your clock, boys and girls, think about what we've talked about with fractions. Think about how many parts there are on this clock if we had to think of this as a pie. There are 4 different parts. That happens to also mean that there are 4 different quarters. So for us to figure out how many minutes are in a quarter, we have to do some counting, and we're going to add the rest of the numbers to the clock. So I'm going to go ahead and add my 1 and my 2, my 4 and my 5, 7 and 8, 10 and 11. So now we have our full clock. Let me just shade these up so it looks nice and consistent, so everything kind of looks the same. Just make them a little bit wider. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is, if you have some crayons or some colored pencils, we're going to color each section of our clock. And I want to use a different color for each one of mine, just because that makes it a little bit more fun for me. So I'm going to just start by shading in this whole section that goes from the 12 down to the 3. And you can take a little bit of extra time to color yours in. I know with the lighting in my dining room, that's a little hard to see, but just do the best you can. And my shading in the next one, where I'm going between 3 and 6. I will shade the next one between 6 and 9. And then I have one more section to shade, and that's between 9 and 12. And you can pause the video to take some time, or you can finish it up after the video. You can just kind of put a little bit of shading in each section and then kind of go from there. So again, we look at our clock and we have 4 quarters on our clock. Well, to figure out how much is in a quarter, we have to figure out how many minutes there are between the 12 and the 3. So if we count, there are 5, 10, 15 minutes in a quarter of an hour. The reason that's different from a quarter on when we're counting money is because think about what your whole is whenever you are counting a dollar. Your whole is 100 cents. So if you had to take 100 cents, 100 pennies, or 4 quarters, each of those values would be 25 cents. So if you took 100 pennies and you put them into 4 even piles, there would be 25 in each pile. That's when we're counting money. For clocks, it's different. There are 60 minutes on a clock, not 100 minutes like we have 100 cents in a dollar, but there's 60 minutes on a clock. So if we take 15 and 15, 15 and 15, we're going to get 60. So here's our first quarter, and we're actually going to label it as such. So I'm going to write on here that that's the first quarter of my clock. This would be the second quarter of my clock. So that's your first quarter of 15 minutes. That's your second quarter of 15 minutes. Put those 2 quarters together and 30 minutes of your clock is shown. 15 here and 15 here. Slide over to this one. This would be our third quarter. And then finally, this is the fourth and final quarter of our clock. So in time, quarters are 15 minutes. In money, quarters are 25 cents because the wholes are different. A whole dollar is 100 cents. A whole hour on a clock is 60 minutes. That's why there's 15 plus 15 plus 15 plus 15. Add all those 15s together and you're going to get 60 minutes. There's one other thing I'd like you to jot down if you would like to. And I'm going to move the clock out of the way to do that just so you can see a little bit better. It'll help us to remember how many minutes are in how many quarters. So we talked about how 1 quarter equals 15 minutes. 1 quarter is 15 minutes. Put that a little closer. That's better. 2 quarters, when 2 quarters have passed on the clock, that means 30 minutes have passed. Three quarters mean that 45 minutes have passed. And finally, if 4 quarters of the clock have passed, that means 60 minutes have passed. So 1 quarter is 15 minutes, 2 quarters is 30 minutes, 3 quarters 45 minutes, and 4 quarters 60 minutes. If you made your clock on a piece of paper with a circle, you could write that right down beneath. If not, you could just put it on a separate piece of paper and kind of have it along with the clock that we just made, and that'll help you to remember how many minutes are in each quarter. Okay, there's one more thing I want us to do on the clock itself, and that is I want us to go back and I want us to think about where on a clock we are whenever we hit a quarter hour, or 2 quarters, or 3 quarters, or 4 quarters. When we start at the top of the clock, 2nd grade, we know that the time in minutes is going to be 0, 0. So go ahead and put that little colon mark and a 0, 0 up at the top. That's just the minutes that we would think about. When you get to the 3, think about what we've talked about with how we count on a clock. When the minute hand is on the 3, think about how many minutes have passed. If you're thinking 15 minutes, you are correct. So whenever that minute hand is on the 3, it's going to be 15 minutes after a certain hour. Or we could also say it's 1 quarter past a certain hour. Slide down to the 6. We know that when the time, the minute hand's on the 6, that means that 30 minutes have passed. That also means that 2 quarters have passed. And then finally, over by the 9, when your minute hand is on the 9, that means that 45 minutes have passed the hour, or 3 quarters. When we get back up to the 12, when our minute hand reaches back up to the 12, we know that 4 quarters in the previous hour have passed, and we're getting ready for a new hour. So we would show our time with the colon, that little symbol with the 2 dots, and then the 0, 0 after, since no minutes have passed the new hour. So that's what your clock should look like, just to help you remember what quarters are. 1st quarter, 2nd quarter, 3rd quarter, 4th quarter. So let's look at a couple of times on our Judy clock to kind of practice how to name quarter hour times. So let me get this ready. A little bit of light up there. Hang on guys, let me turn off my light. That's a little better, a little darker, but at least it doesn't have that glare. Okay, so take a look at the time that we have on our clock, boys and girls. If you are getting pretty good at telling time on a clock, you know that you have to read the hour hand first. It's a little bit past the 5. So the hour for this particular time is 5, and it's on the 3, which think about how many quarters have passed when it's on the 3, the minute hand. 1 quarter has passed. There's a couple of different ways we can name that time. We can say that it's 5:15. We can also say that it's quarter past 5 or quarter after 5. So if you've ever heard your mom or dad or a grown-up or a brother or sister say, hey, we've got to get going, it's already quarter after, that's what they're talking about, that it's 15 minutes after that particular hour. So that's what it means when we say quarter after. Let's look at a different time. I'm going to start us at 3 o'clock, and then I'm going to move just the minute hand. I started at 3 o'clock, So it hasn't been 4 o'clock yet, so the hour is still 3, but now my minute hand is on the 9, which means that 45 minutes have passed. So that time is 3:45. Another way to name that time is you could say that it's 3/4 past 3 o'clock. Now, boys and girls, I don't know that most folks really say it's 3/4 past 3 o'clock, but if you're able to know that 1, 2, 3/4 have passed, then that's showing that you're understanding how a clock works. You could also say for this time that it's 1/4 before 4 o'clock. So if you've ever heard a grown-up or anyone else say it's 1/4 till we need to get going, that means that there's 1/4 left before the next time. Let's look at 2 more for this lesson. We start at 2 o'clock, and I'm going to take it down to 2:30. There's a couple of different ways that we could name that time too, friends. We could say that it's 2:30. That means that half of the clock has passed. Think about how many quarters have passed. We started here, and then we went down to the 6. How many quarters have passed, second grade? If you said 2 quarters passed, you are correct. Here's the first quarter that passed. Here's the second quarter that passed. The first quarter, the second quarter. So instead of naming that time as 2:30, you could say it's 2/4 past 2. Or you could say it's 2:30. Boys and girls, you could also say it's 2/4 before 3. And if you can think about naming the times in kind of those crazy ways, that's helping to understand that you know how a clock works. I know it's a lot to take in, and it might not be super friendly, but we're going to keep working and practicing. Let's look at one more. Okay, start this one at 6 o'clock. And think about where I would need to stop moving my minute hand if I wanted to show that 1/4 past 6 o'clock, that if it was 6:15. Think about where it would go. Take a look at where my first quarter is. If you thought that the minute hand should go to the 3, you are correct. We could call that time 6:15. We could also call it 6:15 or 1/4 past 6 because 1/4 of the clock has gone. So I hope that just helps you to understand a little bit about what quarter hours are on a clock. So now you kind of have another tool to look at when you're telling times where the minute hand is on the 3, the 6, the 9, or the 12. So I hope that helped.